Today I'm going to be reading an extract from the lovely Joana Starnes' latest novel, The Falmouth Connection. I'm really excited to read this. I will be reading an extract from chapter 15, but first a little about the book. Her new novel is a Pride and Prejudice variation, and it begins at Hunsford around the time when Mr. Darcy has decided to follow his heart and propose to Elizabeth. But to his surprise and disappointment, she is summoned to Cornwall to meet a great aunt she never even knew she had. Mr. Darcy is, of course, compelled to follow, only to discover that he might have arrived too late. Elizabeth has already learned of his role in separating Jane from Mr. Bingley, and worse still, there is another gentleman, a peer of the realm no less, who seems intent on courting her. But some words Darcy overhears lead him to suspect that this gentleman, Lord Trevelyan, may not have the best intentions. So, despite his own heartbreak, he feels he should warn her and protect her, and also help Mr. Bingley out of the tight spot that he had placed him in. They all meet at Lord Trevelyan's spring masque, and let's see what happens there. They crossed the ballroom with unseemly haste, and by the time they reached the doorway, the sisters were already outside, standing together next to the stone parapet. As they walked through the door, Darcy could see them clasp each other's hands in a heart-wrenching gesture of tender reassurance, and he drew a ragged breath that ended in a sigh. How could they have made such a dreadful mess of the entire business, himself and Bingley? They desperately wanted to keep them safe and happy, yet all they had achieved, with error after error, was to distress them so and make them wary. At his side, Bingley must have thought the same, or he must have been steeling himself for the encounter, for he too drew a steadying breath, and, removing the darned ornate contraption that concealed his features, he walked steadily on to meet his fate. For her part, Elizabeth withdrew towards the door at his approach to let the other couple talk in private, and at that, Darcy removed his own mask as well. He could not tell if Miss Bennet had seen fit to do the same in response to Bingley's gesture, but, unreasonably, his own anguish softened somewhat as he perceived Elizabeth attempting to rid herself of hers. She seemed to have come to some difficulty, however, for her gloved fingers laboured ineffectually with something at her temple. She sighed in obvious exasperation and removed her gloves, but before she could resume her efforts, Darcy spoke up. "Would you allow me?" he quietly offered, and at her silent nod, he cast his own gloves on the wide top of the parapet and reached to find the catch in the same spot where he had seen her seek it. He swallowed hard, as he had felt the softness of her curls under his fingertips, the softness of her skin just underneath her temple. His fingers slipped gingerly beneath the ribbon around the edge of the smooth mask, and breath caught in his throat as they brushed against her cheek. The urge to linger, to prolong the closeness and savour the bitter sweetness of the moment was stronger than him, a great deal stronger, and he allowed himself a few more fleeting seconds of stolen pleasure before he reluctantly sought the catch again. He found it easily, and also found the tangle. The end of a ribbon had twisted around a hairpin, or perhaps the stem of one of the small flowers braided into her hair. With great care, he tugged it loose until the fastening was fully disentangled. Held in place no longer, the mask fell off her cheek, revealing a sliver of her beloved features. Her eyes shot open. Why had they been closed? And she instinctively reached to catch the mask before it dropped off to the ground. Just as reflectively, Darcy did the same, but she was quicker. Her hand closed on the mask, his fingers closed on hers. Unconsciously, his hand tightened. Soft, warm hands, and very small. Her fingers, curled around the satin-covered shape, were all but hidden underneath his own. At her faint gasp of surprise, or perhaps displeasure, enough sense returned for him to let his hand drop. "I thank you," Elizabeth whispered softly. though whether for his assistance with untangling the knot, or for having released her fingers, Darcy could not tell. She pulled the contraption fully off her face and cast a troubled glance towards her sister. Yet there was nothing she could see. The other pair had retreated to the far end of the terrace, and their backs were turned as they stood close together in earnest conversation, or perhaps one-sided discourse, for it was only Bingley's voice that could be heard in eager, steady murmur. As for the words, none could be distinguished, not that either of them would contemplate eavesdropping. Despite her concern for her dearest sister, Elizabeth glanced away, clearly disinclined to pry. She looked down at her hands, twisting the satin mask this way and that, and it was awfully plain to see that she was most uncomfortable in his presence. Darcy sighed. What else did he expect? Of course she would be ill at ease now, silent, troubled. She had refused his hand in marriage earlier that morning. He winced. It seemed hard to believe that it was just a few hours ago. He seemed to have lived through a lifetime of misery since then. Suddenly she dropped the mask on the parapet alongside her gloves and his, then glanced up to him and began speaking in a low, strained whisper. "I must thank you, sir, for your concern for my sister's feelings. I know it must have been very hard and difficult for you to... Pray do not regard it," he interjected earnestly. "I would do anything." Darcy stopped as her troubled countenance softened once more in compassion, and he fought the urge to beg her not to look at him that way. He drew a deep breath, acknowledging that it was a churlish thought and worse still, untrue, that he would rather have her look upon him with compassion if that was all she had to offer, rather than the anger she had shown in Basingstoke. "Miss Bennet," he brought himself to say, you must have long been desiring my absence. No, I am not necessarily speaking of this very moment," he added, as her tone of countenance suggested she was about to utter some form of civil protest, "but of my departure from these parts. Forgive me, but I cannot leave as yet. There is..." He stopped, then forced himself to press on with the terribly awkward topic. "I fear there is a devilry afoot, and Lord Trevelyan is no stranger to it." There, he had finally said it, and yet no sooner did he begin to feel some satisfaction at having brought it out into the open, that the mild reproach implied by her next retort made his insides turn again for the age-old reason. "Mr. Darcy," she gently chided, "you're prejudiced against his lordship. This is not a matter of prejudice," Darcy burst out, without allowing her to finish. "You must believe that I am not trying to position you, to poison you against a rival. As of this morning," he added with difficulty, "that would be quite unnecessary, and I have no rights. But pray allow me to continue, Miss Bennet," he urged, at her evident desire to stop him. "Just before the ball, I heard him speak to one of his men about keeping watch on all who set foot in Londoness, and of the fact that he had the place surrounded. I know not what he is about, but I urge you, nay, I beg you would allow me to protect you." As he finished speaking, he found that her hand was in his, although he had no recollection of just how that might have come to happen. Yet she did not withdraw it, nor did she step back, but remained there, silent and very still, for a length of time that none thought to measure. When at last she spoke, her voice caught and faltered, and it was so quiet that he could barely hear it. "I thank you. You are very kind, too kind. Yet I do not wish you to be burdened with such concerns, which must be for nothing. There must be a reasonable explanation for your overhearings, presumably measures similarly intended for protection. Mrs. Pencarrow's protection, that is to say," she swiftly added, in a touching attempt to spare his feelings. I understand there is a long-standing friendship between my great-aunt and Lord Trevelyan. I cannot imagine her trust to be misplaced. So I thank you again for your solicitude, but you need not fret, sir. Twice in one day you have done us great kindness, and you have received little for your efforts. Pray, Mr. Darcy, do not trouble yourself further on your account, on mine. You have done more than enough already. Her voice gathered strength as she proceeded, and by the time she had finished, it was warm and firm. Yet it was not her heartfelt entreaty or her compassionate concern that robbed him of his breath, but the barely perceptible touch, the fluttering caress on the back of his fingers. Darcy swallowed and looked down to their clasped hands, and alongside her free one, moving as though without deliberate intent, fingertips lightly stroked his suddenly tingling skin, and he bit his lip, wondering how in God's name he was to overcome the desperate need to kiss her. Elizabeth, he whispered hoarsely, not even realising his faux pas, and at the sound of his tortured voice she started, withdrew both her hands and brought them to her temples. "Forgive me," she burst out. "I am not... What am I doing?" she exclaimed in accents of the deepest contrition. "I beg you would excuse me. I must return to the house." Instinctively, Darcy clasped her wrist. "Pray do not go," he pleaded, but Elizabeth shook her head with something very much like anger. "I must. I had no business to mislead you," she declared with feeling, demonstrating that her anger was directed at herself. "Nothing has changed since this morning, Mr. Darcy, and I should not wish you to think otherwise." "I beg you would not reproach yourself," he urged, and at her obvious distress, he felt compelled to release his hold, only to see her pick up the discarded mask and hide behind it again as she tried to tie the ribbon with swift, nervous motions. "Elizabeth, Miss Bennet," he amended this time. "Is there anything I can say to ease your discomfort?" "I thank you, but too much was said already. I must leave you now. Pray, Mr. Darcy, return home. Return to Pemberley and find your peace there," she earnestly entreated, and, retrieving her gloves, she tugged them back on with some difficulty, for her hands were shaking. Darcy's lip tightened at the affecting sight, and he forebore to tell her that there would be no peace for him, at Pemberley or elsewhere. Before he could find something else to say, something that would not seem exactly calculated to distress her further, the sound of footsteps drew his notice to Miss Bennet hurrying towards them, or rather to the doorway that led back to the house. Her countenance held none of the placid good humour he had grown to associate with her, and the raw edge of pain that had replaced it filled him with shock and horror at the enormity of his past misjudgment. Darcy instinctively lowered his eyes, lest she see him stare and be mortified by her own display of feeling. But it was not him that Miss Bennet glanced at, a plea in her anguished features. It was to her sister, and Elizabeth was prompt to respond. She left him in an instant and rushed to Miss Bennet's side, clasping her hand in tender reassurance and offering hurried words of comfort as she endeavoured to assist her sister to put her mask on, and in her turn hide her acute distress behind the fragile screen covered with gauze and satin. And then she turned to him and curtsied, and a few moments later she was gone. They both were, leaving him crushed by the hopelessness of the encounter and the heart-rending note that it had ended on. A groan behind him suggested that Bingley was not faring any better, which came as no surprise given Miss Bennet's obvious distress and swift departure. With a muted oath, Darcy walked over to his friend. He did not ask him anything. It served no purpose. In the end, Bingley was the one to break the silence. "She would not even hear me," he burst out in accents of deep anguish, which Darcy could not fail to recognise. "She said this was hardly the time or the place, and how can I fault her? Worse still, she said—" Bingley broke off and passed his hands over his face. "She said my comings and goings are so uniformly unexpected that she can only assume I should be on the move again, and soon, with as little warning. She would hear nothing to the contrary, nothing of my deep regard for her, but said that actions spoke louder than avowals and empty protestations. And then she left and asked me not to follow. He burst again into something akin to desperation, that Darcy was compelled to lay a hand on his shoulder in understanding and compassion. She might hear you on the morrow, he quietly offered, but the other merely shook his head. I doubt it. She bade me return to town and seek my amusements elsewhere, he dejectedly imparted, then heaved a long sigh. Whether he expected sympathy or not, none was forthcoming. Darcy's retort was prompt and sharp. If you leave now, then you do not deserve her, he forcefully exclaimed, and at that Bingley lost his temper. Of course I shall not leave. Do you imagine that I would give up? What sort of weak fool do you take me for? Is that what you would do if you were in my place? Give up so easily? If Miss Elizabeth bade you return to Pemberley? Darcy's hand dropped from his friend's shoulder, and then the truth came out at last. I am in your place, he tiredly acknowledged in a ragged whisper. What? Bingley burst, too highly strung for a civil repartee. She did bid me return to Pemberley, and point blank refused my hand in marriage. He was not to receive sympathy either, or at least not expressed in the customary fashion. Bingley merely gave a bitter laugh. You poor devil. So this is why you have been such a bear lately. Forgive me, Darcy, he added softly, even before the other could rouse up the energy to reply in anger. I had not imagined we were both in the same sinking boat. What a fine mess we are in, eh? Bingley shook his head, and it was his turn to pat his friend's shoulder. Shall I tell you now that if you give up so easily, then you do not deserve her? He asked with a mild reproach, or perhaps sarcasm. Nevertheless, he got no answer. With a great deal of effort, Darcy forbore to mention that the similarity of their circumstances ended at the most salient, the most excruciating point. Miss Bennet's current withdrawal from his friend sprung from hurt feelings, but, at some point at least, she did love him, and there was some reason to hope that she might love him still. He could claim nothing of the sort as regards her sister. Elizabeth had been dreadfully clear on the subject, so how could he blithely dismiss her wishes and be so self-willed as to ask again? Thankfully Bingley did not choose to go to him any further. His lingering resentment for Darcy's past misjudgment, or for more recent outbursts, appeared to have left him. When he spoke again, there was nothing but raw earnestness in his voice, and, as he declared with feeling, for my part, I know not how to go about it yet, but I must regain her trust. I have to. I cannot lose her, Darcy. Come hell or high water, I am not giving up. There we go. As I said, I am really excited to read this book. It sounds like a lot of fun, quite an adventure-filled book, which is a change from Joanna's other novels, which I highly recommend. If you haven't read any of Joanna's other stories from this day forward, The Subsequent Proposal, The Second Chance, I highly recommend those as well, and I am so excited to read The Falmouth Connection. I hope that you have enjoyed this extract, and I hope that you will all go and buy the book and read it.